8 years left to end poverty and hunger, to halve global emissions. It didn't start out as planned. We're not moving in the right direction. Years of progress lost in the pandemic. Escalating conflicts, climate breakdown. So where are we now? For decades, we successfully fought poverty. Now it's on the rise, again. 1 out of 10 suffer from hunger, more people than ever forced out of their homes. Climate disasters increasing. Droughts alone estimated to displace 700 million people by 2030. This year, CO2 emissions hit a new record. At this rate, annual emissions will be 14% higher in 2030. Meanwhile, fossil energy receives $700 billion in subsidies from governments.
Your government.
Safe water and sanitation not made accessible fast enough. Progress must quadruple to cover all people by 2030. Women are held back at all levels. At this pace, by 2030, 825 million children won't have secondary level education. Human rights, health, and equality all hurt in the wake of war and disaster. Disrupted economies, food and energy crisis, and galloping costs of living damage global solidarity. Everything interconnected. Everyone intertwined. Business as usual won't cut it. Even though we made progress before, going back to pre-pandemic ways is not enough. We need a new paradigm built on the pillars of our 17 goals. Rethink conventions, flip the orthodoxies. Governments, organizations, corporations, citizens of the world, snap out of it. It's time for bold climate action. To act for women and girls, for social justice and inclusion. Scale up the transition to renewable energy. Create 85 million green jobs. Phase out fossil fuel subsidies and tax carbon. $2.8 trillion. Keep your promises. Support developing nations. Write off debts. Free up $1 trillion for climate resilience, people, and communities. $500 billion for Africa to achieve universal energy access by 2030. Commit to a circular economy now. New, resilient food systems. They can cut waste by 17%. Strengthen domestic financial institutions. Make insurance and banking accessible to everyone. Scale up the digital transformation to educate the 1.6 billion kids who missed school in the pandemic. Educate girls, including the 130 million not in school now. Ensure women's equal share of decision-making. Eliminate discrimination against female workers and boost productivity by 40%. We cannot afford to leave anyone behind. We have a to-do list. We have the resources. 8 years to reach our goals. We're on this planet together. So let's work together. Let's get the list done.
Hello, and welcome to the third and final day of the 2022 SDG Action Zone. If you were with us for days 1 and 2, you already know that I'm your MC, Nadira Hira. And if you weren't here, well, you've been missing out. We've heard from so many fierce, brilliant, inspiring speakers. But don't worry, you can find all the sessions on demand at sdgactionzone.org. So please watch, rewatch, and share. And you're definitely going to want to do all of that with this next performance. We're so lucky to have with us a multidimensional artist, activist, healer, farmer, and educator committed to planetary health and community resilience. Here she is with her incredibly moving poem, Mama Nature Told Me. Welcome, Naima Penniman.
Mama Nature told me, I am part of you. You are part of me. When we forgot, she remembered us. When we were lost, she found us. Mama Nature told me we have more than enough to go around. She showed me a glowing paper birch on the edge of the forest on a south-facing slope, endowed to grow twice as big. With all the sunlight it could ever drink, it could tower over, shade out the rest. It disperses its surplus sugars to boost the other trees instead. Could we be like that? Let go of excess, practice fair distribution of sustenance, regardless of what slope we were born on. Mama Nature taught me we are stronger together. She showed me the interspecies marriage of algae and fungi who fell in love across kingdoms, birthed a new life form capable of making home on stone, adept at staying alive in the harshest conditions. Could we be like that? Join forces across difference, weave our powers, individual but undividable, in the midst of unthinkable circumstances, learn how to flourish together. Mama Nature taught me blackness is precious and must be respected and must be protected from artificial light and must be tended. She showed me the indigo night, the miracle of starlight, the deep, dark ocean, the rich black soils brimming with life. Mama Nature taught me nothing and no one is disposable. It all goes back to the cycle. She showed me there is no such thing as a way. Not for our waste heaped high in landfills or amassing in the Pacific, not for our people deemed throwaway, warehoused in cages and open-air prisons. There is no escaping the totality of this single beating earth. There is no mistaking all of us belong. Mama Nature told me, you are made of the same matter as stardust. Remember your connection to everything. She showed me this animate force of existence pulsing all around us, doing everything in its power to regenerate life, even in death. She showed me a hollowed out tree, still standing, long dead, a hatchery for starlings, a porcupine den, a perch for owls, a hideout for bats, a food cache for chipmunks, a nuthatch's nest. Could we feel our ancestors' love like that? Palpable and present all around us, sheltering and nourishing us, supporting our flourishing. Could we be eternal? Mama Nature taught me death energizes life. Life necessitates death. She showed me cypress seeds enclosed in cones, sealed shut with resin, the hardened shell, the trapped potential, the awakening flame, the wild inferno, the melting walls, the bursting open, the smoky wind, the scattered soaring, the free fall flight to fresh, warm soil, the open sky, the widened space to grow and grow and grow. Could we be like that? Rising from devastation, preparing the way for the next stage of thriving. Mama Nature taught me transformation is inevitable, adaptation is essential, change creates openings. She showed me how dolphins evolved dorsal fins to withstand the wild movement of the ocean, how plants befriended fungi who helped them migrate out of water, who taught them how to grow roots, who showed them how to survive on scorched land, until together they transformed the atmosphere, built soil over stone, and patiently, unmistakably changed the entire world. Could we be like that? Work together to do the unthinkable and shift the course of destiny. Mama Nature asked me, what will be your contribution? How will you partner with renewal to usher evolution? What are you willing to let go of? How are you willing to grow? Will you remember you are intrinsic to something bigger? What will you give rise to with the life force you've been given? Mama Nature asked me, can you hear me? And are you listening?
Today, we turn our attention to climate. The Action Zone is all about determination, solutions, accountability, inspiration, and frankly, hope. But we have to start from a place of truth, no matter how difficult that truth may be. And when it comes to climate, none of it is easy. We find ourselves plagued with inaction from the very people who could most readily make transformative change. Oil and gas companies watch their profits soar to ever new heights, while we watch their products suffocate the world. Elected leaders get better every day at saying the right things, but put to the test by financial crisis or political maneuvering, it's their promises on climate that are the first to be broken. And even influencers who make it their business to highlight the change we each can make as individuals are too often thinking too small. Though it hardly needs saying, I'll say it anyway. The science is undeniable. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres could not have been clearer when he told us last year, in the starkest terms possible, we are sleepwalking to climate catastrophe. That's the damning reality that underpins all our conversations today. We need radical change to make real progress on climate, and we have to keep our promises. We're just weeks away from COP27, the UN's climate change conference, and as all eyes turn to Egypt for that convening, it's only natural to reflect. There have been so many heartfelt speeches and soaring commitments over the years, but where have they gotten us, really? Is it likely or even possible at this point for us to keep 1.5 alive? That is, to limit the global average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels? Has the $100 billion that wealthy nations pledged more than a decade ago to help more vulnerable countries adapt to and mitigate climate change found its way to the developing world? There may still be some time to make good on all of this, but declarations of intent won't get us there. We have to act with the urgency of now to turn rhetoric into reality. Just what does that mean? Well, that's what we'll be listening for today. Throughout the day, we'll hear from the doers, the demanders, the champions, the allies, and the activists fighting to protect the vulnerable. We'll welcome scientists, farmers, indigenous voices, green energy pioneers. We'll speak to government and business leaders making extraordinary climate commitments. We'll be calling out greenwashing and empty promises and putting concrete climate solutions firmly on the table. We'll pair some of today's most dynamic young activists with the pioneers on whose shoulders they stand. And we'll hear them tackle themes that should be top of mind for all of us. The desperate need for serious leadership and political will. The push for unprecedented multi-sector collaboration. And why what may matter most is just having the courage to do what needs to be done, for people and for planet. Before we dive in, though, just a few quick reminders. First on the list, of course, is hearing from you. Our Ask Away sessions on days 1 and 2 were packed with probing questions, and we will expect nothing less today. So remember to use the chat box on the side of your screen to pose questions all day long, and tune into our final Ask Away session later on to hear what our speakers have to say. We'll also be posting our live polls to that chat box, so definitely look out for those too. Finally, social media. Please post up a storm on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, anywhere and everywhere, and help us spread all this incredible Action Zone content. Be sure to use hashtag SDG Action Zone and hashtag For People for Planet. And feel free to tag our handle at SDG Action Zone and follow us everywhere you social. And that's it. I can't wait to get our day started. So stay tuned and I'll be right back with today's opening conversation. We've recently seen a tsunami of net zero pledges, but for every so-called commitment announced, there seems to be one that comes to nothing. To ensure companies, cities, and investors walk the talk of their net zero promises, the UN Secretary General has put together the high-level expert group on net zero commitments of non-state entities, and it's our next speaker's job to chair it. She's someone that, simply put, gets things done. As Canada's former environment minister, she developed and negotiated Canada's first comprehensive climate plan. It put a price on pollution, phased out coal, and doubled conservation land in partnership with Indigenous communities. She's a true powerhouse for climate. Thank you for joining us at the SDG Action Zone, Catherine McKenna. Hello.
Great to join you. And join everyone who's watching. Hi.
Hello. They're so happy to have you here. And why don't we start with accountability, actually? How are we holding businesses to the grand commitments so many of them have made? How are we making those commitments real?
Well, I mean, that's really the job of the high-level expert group. And the Secretary General has been really clear. He's concerned about greenwashing. And greenwashing is bad because if you happen to be a company and you say, oh, okay, I'm going to be net zero, and you don't do any work, say you're buying cheap offsets from an Indigenous community that sees no benefits and maybe sees huge detriments, that's a massive problem. It's a problem because it's going to breed cynicism, but it's also a problem because we're never going to tackle climate change. And so this is a huge part of what we need to do is make sure that these commitments that folks are making, it's non-state actors. So it's not just businesses and financial institutions, it's also cities and regions. It's making sure that you actually do the work. It's easy to say you're going to be net zero. It's harder to do it. And I think we need to be very careful that it's really getting as close to zero emissions as possible, not buying your way through a net zero approach.
So many things I want to touch on there. For starters, though, it's so easy to make these commitments, and then you get the goodwill from the public, you get the headlines, and you almost don't have to follow through because it seems like we're not getting the same level of coverage when the commitments don't actually happen. So to your exact point, we do have to hold people to that. But practically speaking, how does that happen? And what can we do to support the efforts to hold them to those commitments in real ways?
Well, I mean, first of all, we need these commitments to be real. And by real, it's like, don't say that you're going to be net zero by 2050 and do nothing until 2049. And the good news is it's actually not that hard if you're being transparent because your emissions either go up or they go down. And the money that you're investing either flows to clean or it flows to fossil fuels and the status quo. And so transparency is absolutely critical. Early action, so seeing early pledges and how are you making progress against these pledges. And in the end, we also need to figure out how to hold people accountable because that's not good enough. And I have to give a huge shout out because I'm sure a lot of folks out there, we have environmental organizations, civil society organizations, lots of people that are trying to hold companies to account and are doing some hard work, actually doing research on what's going on. But we're going to need something that is more than that. And so how do you do that? Well, ultimately, we really need to get to regulation. So that's part of our mandate at the end of the day is figuring out what's the pathway to regulation. Because by the way, it should be pointed out, while there are a lot of net zero pledges by companies, financial institutions, there's a whole range of them that are not making even a net zero pledge. So we need this to cover everyone. We need people to have rules around how, when they say they're net zero, what action do they need to do? They need to do it in a transparent way. And ultimately, they need to be graded. And if they're failing, then there needs to be consequences.
So is it fair to say you're working on that? Grades, consequences, all the things those of us who've been to school understand actually motivate
exactly.
action.
I have my kids, they've started back on school. I said, you got to do the work. You don't do the work, you're going to fail. So yes, that's what the working group and the expert group is doing. And I have to give a shout out to the Secretary General because he has put together an amazing group. And I know people are always wondering, like, who are these people? Well, let me tell you that the 18 members of the expert group, first of all, it's gender balance. That was a condition mission for me. And it's also experts from around the world from a variety of different backgrounds, whether environmentalists or scientists or, past recovering politicians like me, or people that have regulated, people that have different expertise from also all regions of the world. And what we also need to think about this, and we're thinking very hard, is how do you make sure equity and justice is thread throughout? Because it's one thing to say everyone needs to get out of fossil fuels, but we actually have massive issues, and we know in developing countries on access to energy. So we need money to flow in massive quantities to renewable energy in the global south. And that is part of being net zero. You cannot say I'm a champion on climate if you're not also making sure that those investments are going. One, you got to stop investing in fossil fuels, but two, we need to make sure those investments are going to support real people who need it. And by the way, this really matters, because sometimes people say, oh, net zero, who cares? If everyone doesn't do the work, if the money doesn't flow to renewable energy, if we're not making sure that we don't get out of fossil fuels, we know that we're headed for even more catastrophes. We've seen what's happened in Pakistan, massive flooding. Pakistan is less than 1% of the emissions, and a third of the country is underwater, and the impact on real people and their lives is completely unfair. So this really matters, and we've got a great group working really hard.
And we should all be incensed by that, right? If we're walking through our lives saying we're good people, that should be something that drives us absolutely nuts. You alluded earlier to offsets, and I have to ask, what do you say to those people that are like, a lot of this feels like it's more about sort of balancing your bad behavior rather than correcting it or turning it into good behavior? Talk a little bit about that approach.
Well, I mean, I think that first of all, you just have to start at first principles. You can't offset your way to tackling climate change or reducing your emissions. You need to do the work. And so that's a basic principle, that it has to start with you. It has to start with the companies across your supply chain to actually really reduce emissions. You can't just go buy offsets and then say, well, but I'm going to continue to pollute and not do any work in that front. So that is a massive problem. But there's another problem. There's a huge problem on where are we getting these credits or offsets? Like, where are they? Often, and I just had a conversation with Indigenous peoples around the world, and they were giving examples of offsets being used without their free, prior, informed consent, taking land away from them, or planting trees that were not a native species that were having unintended consequences. So it's not just like, should you be doing the work as opposed to just buying credits or offsets? It's actually, what are these credits and offsets, and what are the real impacts? And so that's a very thorny issue. We're certainly looking at that, because that's when you say net zero, that's the net. So a lot of people are relying a lot on, well, I don't have to go to real zero, I could do net.
Yeah, the semantics.
So we need to figure this out, because otherwise it's actually just helping greenwashing as opposed to actually helping the planet.
Absolutely. So going to your experience as a reformed politician, or recovering politician, as you said, one of the things that's come up a lot, and I think it's right, is this idea of how we shift mindsets. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how, thinking about the climate legislation and that you were involved in, how you actually got to the place of making it so inclusive and pushing beyond what the sort of usual solutions are, so that some of the folks who are watching and some of the folks who those people are constituents for might use that as their own lesson for setting their own agendas for the work they're planning to do.
Well, I mean, I think everyone has a different role, but I was a politician and I needed to land policies. And one of the most challenging policies was putting a price on pollution, because opponents to it said, you're just going to raise the price on everything. Yeah. And I think sometimes all of us who really care about climate need to step back and actually say, are there some things that we need to think about? And the cost of living is a real thing, right? You do not want to hurt people, especially those that have so little. And so we designed the price on pollution, where there's a price when you pollute. So if you go to the pump, pay a price, but the money goes back to people. And in fact, it actually provides more money to those that pollute the least, which are those that have the least means. And so, in fact, it actually was a positive policy that actually has raised huge numbers of families out of poverty. And so if you can do that, if you can really think about real people, not just about the policy, but about real people. And how are you thinking about the consequences of your policies in a way that you get multiple benefits in that case? I think that's really, really important. Of course, communicating. That would be also, I try to sound like a real person. It's sometimes hard in the climate space.
You do.
No acronyms. That's my free advice. Everyone use acronyms.
That's great advice. I feel like that's another drum I'm banging all the time about how we communicate. But maybe on that last note of communication and also telling the story, what's a metric that you're watching or something that you think, wow, when I see that happen, I'll know we're on the right trajectory and things are actually changing?
You know what? There's only one thing that matters. We're looking at 1.5 degrees. Now, in certain places, we know in Canada, we're already warming more than 2 degrees, and that's having huge impacts on our Arctic, and that's same in other places in Africa. But we have a temperature goal. And in life, you need to focus on the thing, and the thing is climate. But the thing in climate is actually, we have the Paris Agreement. Everyone's agreed they have to do their part, and that we have a very clear temperature goal. That's the only thing that matters. It's not about being net zero. It's whether emissions are going down. And I would say also, is the money flowing in the quantums that we need to the places that need it? So that's what I look at. I just measure things. But I think we have a huge opportunity. And I think there's a huge movement, especially young people. Every day I have 3 kids and they are like, Mom, today did you fight for the planet? I try. I tell them every day I try, but there's so many amazing young people. So just keep it up. Keep on pushing because things are changing. You are holding people accountable, and your parents and grandparents are starting to get it. Sometimes it took them a while, but it really matters because we only have one planet.
And it's happening. So thank you, Catherine McKenna. I think you're doing a little more than measuring things, but we'll take it, whatever it is. It's been wonderful to have you in the SDG Action Zone, and we'll see all of you right after this. Hello again. It's time for our opening climate panel, and you won't want to miss a moment when you hear who's joining us. First up, a climate scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, who uses satellite data and models to study the rapidly changing Earth. He's here speaking on his own behalf, and we are so lucky to have him. He has a PhD in physics from Columbia University and a BA in physics from Harvard, and his award-winning book, Being the Change, Live Well and Spark a Climate Revolution, gives real-life solutions for moving away from a consumerist lifestyle. Welcome to the founder of No Fly Climate Sci, Dr. Peter Kalmas. And next, hello.
Hey.
And next is a global leader and advocate for SDG 7, affordable and clean energy. She's the chief executive and special representative of the UN Secretary General for Sustainable Energy for All, as well as co-chair of UN Energy. She's also a commissioner for the Global Commission to End Energy Poverty and co-chair of the COP26 Energy Transition Council. Thank you for making time for us, Damilola Agumbi. So let's get started. Peter, what's the state of the climate movement? Where are we?
So in my opinion, the climate movement needs to get a lot stronger. We basically need 1 billion climate activists. The movement has to get stronger than the fossil fuel industry because in probably every country, certainly in many, many countries, the fossil fuel industry has gotten involved in politics and in the media. And so they're stopping action on climate by essentially what we call lobbying politicians. In my opinion, is legalized bribery. And so we have this, one of the most powerful industries in the world, kind of calling the shots, even infiltrating COP26 last year. And so we need to have a climate movement that is stronger than them.
Damilola, does that assessment resonate with you? And what's your take?
I mean, my take is, well, first, I completely agree with what Peter is saying, but my take is that apart from just, having 1 billion climate activists, they also have to be stroke on stroke energy activists. We're dealing with the world that we have 670 million people with absolutely no access to electricity. So they can't join us on this nice call today. They don't have anything at all. And almost 2 billion people who have no access to clean cooking. And that causes an enormous amount of deforestation because especially women and children are still using fuel wood to do these tasks, right? So, I feel that we need to hit all angles. One thing that I'm totally clear about is we can't continue this narrative that it's, we have to do something for one half of the world and the other half of the world have to be the victims of it. Because we all know if we do not achieve our targets of 2030 of affordable energy, we're not going to achieve our climate goals. There's no scenario where you leave almost 1 billion people behind. So that is what I would continue encouraging with the message, but completely agree with what Peter is saying.
So it makes so much sense. There's no scenario where we can leave 1 billion people behind, and yet that's the scenario we're in if we continue in the model we're in right now. So I think what strikes me is that we are both hearing from both of you that you've got this sort of privileged tier at the top that's setting the tone, and sometimes the messaging isn't matching the reality, and all of these folks at the quote unquote bottom who need to be not just mobilized, but who need to be listened to, who need to be engaged in this process. How do we actually do that? Because everything you're saying right now makes sense to the people watching, but that cognitive step of what we actually do to get there, both as individuals, but also at all the higher levels that we're talking about, hasn't quite made sense to us yet. So what's your take on how we actually do what you're asking us to do?
I mean, I think firstly, sorry, I didn't know if that was for Peter, but I think
it's for both of you.
For both of us, okay, great. I think firstly, we need to understand just how bad the situation is, right? So, being born Black African, of which I am, even if you have energy, you're 20 times at a disadvantage of any other person on earth with the lack of energy you have. So there needs to be an understanding that to lift 1 billion people out of energy poverty will mean more energy is needed. And there has to be understanding that rich countries have to use less energy. Energy efficiency is key, to allow that to happen. So that needs to be a basic understanding that nobody can thrive. There's no graph where you live in an equitable world with no energy at all. And I think that's missing. The other thing that's obviously clearly missing is the funding going into the developing world for them to actually do climate projects and then for them to do energy access projects, because we're at a unique time now that we don't want to go back to these countries and energy transition again, right? We want them to have a low carbon trajectory from the start, because there is hardly any energy. Sub-Saharan Africa, if you take away South Africa, barely has 81 gigawatts of installed capacity. That's the same thing as like the country of Germany. It's actually quite absurd if you think about it, right? So they can grow in a low carbon way. They can grow with renewables if the funding is actually made available. Obviously, there's a policy framework. Obviously, there's a data framework as well. But what we are definitely seeing clearly is that, it's almost like they've really, really been left behind. They've been told to stop doing this, stop doing that, but there's not really any funding to do what they should be doing. And development and growth and industrialization, if I'm going to be clear, is still needed in these societies.
And yet commitments keep rolling out and we're not seeing them actually translated into reality. But it actually works so well with the message that you have, Peter, because moving away from a consumerist lifestyle or a consuming lifestyle in general is the only way that the people who have the privilege of energy just at a baseline can actually make room for everyone else. How do we do that?
So it's really important to understand that the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions on this planet are coming from a tiny fraction of the richest people on the globe. I mean, the statistics are just astounding. So there's a very strong correlation between how much energy is used, which right now it's mostly from fossil fuels, so that translates directly into CO2 molecules going to the atmosphere and making the planet warmer, and how wealthy somebody is. There's a few really important things missing in the sort of global climate discussion or the actions that are happening or not happening right now. All right. So one of them is we have to understand that this is a global emergency. So far, a lot of the sort of actions, the policies, the discussions at the United Nations level have this sort of implicit assumption that business as usual can continue and that we can build out renewables to keep supporting that business as usual activity around the world, while somehow bringing up poorer nations of the world to that level of energy use. And we have already passed, in my mind, any safe notion of where we're at in terms of global heating. We saw this just this summer, just a few days ago, massive flooding in Pakistan. Those people who lost, many of them lost their lives, many of them have lost their livelihoods, did so little to contribute to global heating right now. So that's a moral issue, right? And that's part of why I completely agree with everything Damilola said. There's also a very practical component to this, which is that, I kind of alluded to it earlier, the ruling class, the richest people right now are calling the shots. They basically are in some sense controlling the politicians. And that's also true for the fossil fuel industry itself. And the more capital somebody has in this global society, the more capital they're able to accrue. It's almost like it has a gravitational attraction. Like the more money you have, the more money you can get, and the more you
Which
can.
Which is gross.
Yeah, the more you can warp the sort of politics and make sure that the policies protect that status quo, protect your riches. So there's a fascinating thing that happened in France a couple of years ago called the Yellow Jacket movement. They tried to put a gas tax on, a tax on petrol to make gasoline more expensive, but they did that in a way that didn't protect the poor and the working class. So they suddenly couldn't afford to drive to work. Energy was a huge part of their income already, and it got to be an even bigger part. So they protested. They said, hell no, we don't want climate action if it means we can't even drive to work. So all of these policies, we need to ramp down the fossil fuel industry. It's causing 80% of this global heating. About 15% is being caused by the animal agriculture industry. So we have to ramp that down too. But we have to do it in a way that protects the poor people of the world, the working class. Otherwise, it's going to be a non-starter. And that applies across nations too, right? So if the rich nations of the world say, we need to ramp down the fossil fuel industry, we're going to impose hardships on the poorer nations of the world, they're going to say hell no too, just like the Yellow Jackets did in France. And they're going to say, we're not going to cooperate. But we need everyone on board. We need global cooperation in an emergency mode. Like the fires that we're seeing, the flooding, we're already food prices are starting to get more expensive because of crop yield losses due to global heating. And that's all of this stuff is going to get just catastrophically worse in the coming years. Like we haven't even started seeing the tiniest bit of the climate impacts and disasters that we're going to start seeing over the next few years and decades. So from a practical point of view, we have to figure out a way to get the global rich who are controlling everything and trying to get as much wealth as possible to stop that control and to let, we have to basically pry that wealth and that power from them and distribute that globally to the poor and the working class so that the transition can happen in a way that everyone can get on board, and that way it can happen fast.
So I just wanted to touch on that point.
Don't apologize.
Because it's a really important point, right? What is currently happening in the world is that if something looks like it might affect energy security, people are leaving climate behind. And they're doing it in the richest countries. So just the switch to coal, which is temporary, that some of the European countries have taken up, is the same level of emissions as 24 African countries. So I just want you to understand the scale of it. And the truth is, the fact that can even happen, and we're like, oh, that needs to happen to secure, the richest people dealing with the richest problems. For me, it is not equitable. And that is why developing countries are screaming, because they still need to develop. People are poor. We think of an energy crisis happening now. You see what's happening on continent. Like people can't afford food. They can't afford any basics. You're not going to put over that a climate crisis. What you can show clearly, and what we're trying to do, is the data actually shows that moving cleaner, moving greener actually helps your economy. So I think sometimes the way we even speak to developing countries has to change. I always start with GDP growth. I always start with jobs. I don't start with climate, right? It just shows how beneficial it is. But we have to hold the richest countries in the world accountable. There is no scenario where the poorest countries in the world with the least amount of money leapfrogs. It will not happen. And it's very key. And this is something we are also advocating for at the UN.
And
Sorry, Peter.
in COP26, the amount of money that the rich nations were proposing to transfer to the poor nations was absolutely insulting. I think it was, wasn't it a few $100 million? I mean, it was
technical assistance, of course,
right,
not actually money
nothing.
to do. Yeah, not money to do projects.
I think we're on the verge of, we need to transition to a complete new way of thinking about sort of global, brotherhood and sisterhood, and that we're all in this together. We haven't gotten there yet. And you can also understand the current climate emergency as coming from hundreds of years of colonial extraction, where the rich nations of the world have basically, extracted and moved wealth from the poorer nations of the world. And that's why there's such a huge wealth imbalance today. So I firmly believe that as part of starting to actually address the global climate emergency, in addition to we have to stop beating around the bush. I want to say this really clearly. We have to rein in and ramp down the fossil fuel industry as quickly as we can. That is what is causing this problem. They have infiltrated the discussions and the planning to such a degree that we get all of this talk about renewable build out and carbon capture, which in my opinion is probably pie in the sky because it's going to be so expensive. And yet they always, planting trees, they deflect the discussion away from the core of the matter, which is we need a plan year by year. We have to say, these nations have contributed the most to the problem. They have to ramp down at this rate faster than the poorer nations. They have to do it like this year, they have to get to here, this year they have to get to there. And we have to go very fast because people are already dying. And I study extreme humid heat. I am terrified by the sorts of heat waves we are going to start seeing in the next few years, especially in the global south. And I think that the other thing I was going to say is that I think in terms of global cooperation and shifting into a new kind of emergency mode regime, the rich nations of the world, I think, should seriously start planning for how they can forgive debt that the poor nations of the world owe them after hundreds of years of colonial extraction.
So I have to say, I'm smiling here not because this doesn't alarm me on every level, but my favorite thing as a moderator is when the conversation doesn't even need me. All I'm doing is being like, yes, 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 over here. But two things really strike me about what you're both saying, which I think resonates with our entire audience here. One, so much of this is about how we talk about it. The statistics you guys have just alluded to in this conversation are staggering. And there's an extent to which we're so used to hearing them now that we almost tune them out. So I would love for you to reflect individually, if you want, on how we actually communicate this message in a way that really captures the dire starkness of it so that people get energized rather than kind of tuning it out. And the other thing that strikes me is this conversation around mindset shift, because we're saying we've got to take the power back from the rich, but there's this undercurrent of just a lack of empathy, a lack of actually being part of the human community, like we're talking about. And when has that gone? When did that go away? I mean, it's always been sort of a talking point, even if it didn't actually practically exist. But now we're in a moment where we need to actually be a human community. And how do we really communicate that to people who are prioritizing their own convenience and comfort above all else? Either of those big questions, what do you guys want to jump in on?
I would take it on and I would add another dimension to it. It's not just, I mean, I don't know what is going to happen for us to come together as a human, a community that actually cares about other person. I think fundamentally, one person needs to care about the development of somebody else. I think that's why we all get into this. It could be the planet, it could be another human being. But what we're seeing, and what is even shocking, and to the fossil fuel conversation, is there's more fossil fuel contracting now happening between Africa and Europe than ever before. So there's a crisis in Europe, and everyone is turning to Africa for all these new agreements, but they're not turning to Africa to also invest in renewables, right? And this is country levels. Last time I was in my country, Nigeria, there were about 7 EU energy ministers looking for oil and gas. This is a real thing that's happening on ground, but no one's really speaking to that even the energy being extracted in Africa goes somewhere else, right? Mm-hmm. Mostly. That's exactly what's happening, and it's just going to continue. There has to be somewhere, like, if you're going to take from us, at least invest back. right? I mean, there needs to be, and this is country to country. I'm not even talking about the fossil fuel industry. These are countries because you have sanctions in the EU saying we're not going to invest in fossil anywhere else, but you can take fossil for other countries to your country, but it doesn't line up, especially for development and definitely for developing countries. The other thing that just that needs to be so clear is that in terms of when we talk about true development and multilateralism and everything that we're doing, you need to give people a basic standard of living, right? The basics needs to be there. And for the first time, we can have that. We can have climate, energy, and development working together instead of in silos. Like people just have this thing that you either choose climate or you choose energy or you choose a good life. No, it isn't like that. But at some point, you have to look at yourself and say, people have to use less. And if this is an emergency, which it is, in COVID, the richest countries found 17 trillion in like 6 months, right? When everyone says there's no money, they found that to help their economies, and there's nothing wrong with that. So there must be money somewhere for a climate crisis. I don't even call it climate change anymore, for a climate crisis. So I'm not sure if I've answered your questions, but those are the things that have actually, come to me as key points moving forward on just how bad things are on ground.
No, it makes absolute sense. Peter?
Yeah, so it's really a problem of power. Like I said, you can't just you try to wrap your head around the enormity of what's happening to the planet and the enormity of this corporate power and billionaire power, these ultra rich people. A few of them are starting to voluntarily relinquish some of that power, but it's not happening nearly fast enough. So again, that's why I think it all comes back to the global climate movement. But the media, in terms of communication, in my opinion, the media, the global news media, the global entertainment media, it's not telling this story to the public in a way that treats it like the emergency that it is. And that's a huge drag on building the movement. Like, it's very hard to get the movement to build when you have people engaging in civil disobedience and the news media is portraying them as the bad guys, right? And protecting the fossil fuel industry and the CEOs and not reporting on the lobbying. That's happening all the time, right? For example, in the United States, there was just a new bill that passed, and because of lobbying, it's ostensibly a climate bill. It's first of all, it's not enough. It's not going fast enough. But second, it's actually has an expansionary part for the fossil fuel industry, huge new guarantees of sales of public land to the fossil fuel in the United States for leasing, both onshore and offshore, to the fossil fuel industry. And the science is so clear that to have even a 50-50 chance of staying under 2 degrees Celsius of global heating at this point, which I believe is going to be far more catastrophic than anyone realizes yet. So that's 2 degrees. We have to have a complete end to new fossil fuel expansion, new fossil fuel build out right now. We're not getting that because that's not what's profitable for the people that hold all of the power right now. So in terms of trying to build this movement, to build that power, to make this very rapid change that we need to basically survive on planet Earth, the only form of communication I found that's really been effective so far is actually civil disobedience. So taking a risk, risking arrest, risking my career working for NASA, that somehow managed to cut through all the noise. The media tried to not report on it. It actually got out through social media first. And then once it turned into a big story on social media, that's when the actual corporate media finally started reporting on it. But I was begging the corporate media to report on this. Like, scientists around the world are so desperate that they are risking arrest, and it was being completely ignored in the media. But this is the level of emergency I believe that we are in right now, that people with influence and people without influence, people everywhere, taking risks that they can, because increasingly this is life or death, especially for people in the global south, but not just for people in the global south anymore, for people everywhere. No place is going to be safe from impacts of global heating caused by burning fossil fuel.
Well, I have to take just 30 seconds to quickly ask calls to action, but it sounds like, Peter, is that your call to action to risk your livelihood, especially if you're a person of influence or privilege?
Yes, it is. More so, I think it's good to stop flying. I think people who still fly should be calling for an end to global aviation, to an end to frequent flyer programs, for example. We should not have frequent flyer programs in a climate emergency. We probably shouldn't even have commercial aviation because it's, let's face it, it's a want. It's a very strong want, but it's not really a need. Not very many people are going to die if we don't have commercial aviation. And I pick on aviation because to me, it's a bellwether. It's a sort of litmus test for whether society has transitioned into treating this like the emergency it is, or whether society is still trying to pretend that we can keep business as usual going, which is just digging us deeper and deeper into this problem. So as much as everyone loves flying, especially the globally rich, so the vast majority of people on the planet can't even afford to get on a plane, but as much as the global rich love flying, we have to start realizing what an emergency that we're actually in.
Yep, and not just plant trees to pretend we're offsetting the impact.
Yeah, and if you plant a tree someplace and it gets hotter and drier in that place, that tree's just going to die anyway. I mean, the mortality in the Western United States and in other parts of the world of trees, just trees dying, brown hillsides in the Sierra Nevada mountains, which I love dearly. It's just heartbreaking to see how many trees are dying. So the cause of the fossil fuel industry to save what can still, it's irreversible, the damage is irreversible. To save what can still be saved, we need a plan to ramp down the fossil fuel industry as quickly as we can. I think net zero by 2050 is far too late. And to do that, since the fossil fuel industry has all the power, we need an extremely strong grassroots global climate movement.
And with that, Damilila, I want to give you the last word, calls to action.
So obviously the climate crisis is terrible and irreversible, but what is currently going on and has been going on for a number of years as well is 4 million people are dying from using fuel wood to cook, and let's be honest, they're not seen as a crisis. So while we talk about people, talk about planet, it has to be people-centered climate emergencies and climate acceleration. And for that, data and funding is needed. There's only about 2 African nations that have full energy transition plans that showcase how they can actually get to pathways of net zero. So you're asking people to do things they don't even know how to. And one of them is my country, Nigeria, that shows clearly you need about $1.9 trillion for the energy transition of that country. But also like 410 billion of that is above business as usual spending. So it's important to understand the quantum of funding needed, because being a developing country as well, they want to get their people out of energy poverty. They want to grow and they also want to industrialize. It's not as simple as switching something on and switching something off. So my message is please try and be understanding to the whole planet and people in the developing and emerging economies just as much as in the developed world.
And what a stark snapshot just in those 2 answers of how wide the gap is. On the one hand, it's fly less to your conferences and your vacations. On the other hand, it's please think about people who need to cook to feed their families.
Absolutely.
I mean, I couldn't end on a better moment, but this conversation could have gone on for many more hours. I'm glad you two are connected now because I think it's going to be a great friendship moving forward. But Thank you, Peter Kalmas. Thank you, Damilila Gunbi. And thank you to all of you out there in the SDG Action Zone.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, Damilila.
I'm so pleased now to sit down with Germany's most prominent youth activist. Fresh off of meeting Greta Thunberg in 2018, she went on to co-organize Germany's Fridays for Future movement, completed her geography degree in 2019, and is now pursuing a master's in resource analysis and management. Somehow, she's also found time to publish 2 books on the climate crisis. And she hosts the Spotify original podcast, whose German name I will not attempt out of love and respect for the language, but it translates in English to 1.5 degrees. It's great to have you with us, Luisa Neubauer.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I have to ask you, could you say the name of your podcast?
Well, it's called 1,5 Grad, so it really literally means 1.5 degree. And this is really what this podcast is all about, how to stay on the line, how to save for everything that is out there to save.
It's wonderful. And we recommend everybody listen to it. Why don't we jump into our conversation around this idea of youth activism, because you are in many ways the face of the movement in Germany, and you're known in particular for a very famous and sort of ingenious lawsuit. So could you talk to us a little bit about that and why that action mattered so much?
Yes, of course. So in 2019, we organized mass marches after mass marches. We brought millions of people across the country on the streets, with really ending up with 1.5 million people on one single day in autumn of 2019. And we got things moving. I mean, activism works, we know that. Yet what didn't move quite as much as needed was our government. So at some point, after we've really mobilized the entire country, we went into every corner of society. We went into schools and to companies, into churches and clinics and kindergartens. We went to all those spaces, and we got those conversations growing. We grew the political pressure as well. But we felt, okay, maybe it's time to take another step. And that's when we decided to sue our government in front of the Constitutional Court of Germany, which is really the highest court there is, and argued that the inaction of a government is threatening our younger generation's safety, our freedoms and rights that we want to have in the future. And that really was a step that we didn't take lightly, because growing up in a democracy, you don't want to sue your own government, but we felt it was necessary, and we won.
You won. I mean, that's the bottom line. What were the lessons that come out of that for you? Because I have to say, on the one hand, that seems staggering as an action to take from outside, but at the same time, it makes perfect sense, because the way you framed it is exactly right. It's not enough. And who do we hold accountable for that, if not our governments? So what were the lessons you took away, and how should those of us who are trying to be activists in our own communities use that to sort of cognitively motivate us?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Maybe just to name two things that really that I really learned throughout this process. One, of course, it's all collaboration. So these these lawsuits, they are possible because we had a number of NGOs working there. We were a number of youth activists and young people suing together, and it was a process that really, took an entire year to really get going. And the case could only happen because there were so many lawsuits happening before that really laid the foundation for the case then. So it's easy to tell a singular story about these wins, make it a one historic moment that happened. But after all, it was really a combination of things and events and people that came together. And secondly, I think it is easy, looking at those cases, to overstate the importance of those cases. We need climate litigation everywhere, but climate litigation works when there is a normative shift happening in societies, because that's what those courts respond to. We worked our asses off, and
don't be sorry, it's true.
we mobilized the society everywhere. We shifted norms. We worked to grow power in places where it didn't used to be, with young people, for instance, and in the climate arena. And that only made possible that we won at court. All these things need to come together. There is not that one solution that will bring us, out of the climate crisis, but rather it is about us trying every single way we can think of.
And it really is a chicken or egg thing, as you say, because on the one hand, legislation doesn't shift mindsets all the time, but it can make people think differently who wouldn't have been predisposed to that. And then at the same time, legislation often follows what is actually happening out in the streets. So it's important for us to be looking at these from all of these things from so many different angles. But I wonder, as you look out at what's happening in the movement, are there things that are missing? What are you hoping sort of the next front is in terms of us actually being able to move the needle on climate?
Well, I think there is a big question about how do we proceed with the destruction that is ongoing. And we understand that we don't have any wiggle room anymore for a bit more of fossil fuels, a bit more of exploitation, a bit more of fossil growth. These things need to be stopped. And we've learned that warm words and, nice pledges, they haven't worked the way we needed them to. And so I think a large part of what we need to do will be about blocking these things, maybe in front of courts, maybe in societies with political power, or with grassroots movements really rising up to block what is destroying livelihoods in this very moment. And then I think we need to think about who is implementing the transition that is needed. And I think, activism is seen as that what is happening on the streets is the people with the flyers and the banners. But activism for me is also what's happening within institutions, where people are getting going and breaking the frame they used to operate under, and reshaping and reshifting what is possible, what can be done within those institutions that we very much rely on within the decarbonization that's going on.
And in that sense, activism is a part of our everyday life. It has to be integrated into everything that we do. I do have to say, one of the striking things for me about talking to Gen Z activists is just the way that you communicate. Because when you said just now, we don't have any wiggle room for just a little more exploitation. On the one hand, you think that's sort of a funny thing to say, but it's exactly how we need to be thinking about it, because we don't have that wiggle room, and we are sort of constantly just pushing the bar a little farther and trying to fit in a little more bad, hoping that somehow it'll be good in the end, which is crazy. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you communicate and why you communicate that way, because not being able to listen to your podcast in German, I can already tell that it's brilliant. And I feel like that's sort of the hallmark of how your generation talks about these subjects. So what are the lessons that you might share about how we communicate effectively around this, and what power that can have?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't think I've ever been asked that. So I think, for one, we really need to think, who are we talking to? Mm-hmm. And in these times of crises, it's more important than ever to understand that one of our biggest enemies is despair. So we need to save people from despair, and that is why we need to have those spaces. And that's what I try to do in my podcast, where we create a room of hope, of rigor, of radical hope, and of honesty with where we at and what is at stake and what is needed from us. That is what is needed on the one side. And then, of course, on the other, we need those moments where we speak truth to power, where we call out those that have brought us into this mess, and where we stop using, the nice gestures and the small talky bits that is requested, that works at media, that people want to see from us, or the niciness that is really shallow in times where we don't have a single day to waste on empty words. And if we want, fossil fuel companies and leaders to stop with the empty words and the empty promises, we need to do that ourselves and be bold and what is at stake.
Yeah. So setting the example, starting with ourselves, but I also love this idea that it doesn't seem shocking to you that radical hope and radical honesty can exist together. And that, I think, is also a real hallmark of the way you all have approached this, which is a lesson for all of us. So just with the minute or two we have left, I would love to hear what success looks like for you. As you look forward, what's something that might happen that will let you know we're on the right trajectory finally, and that there is hope for beating back the climate crisis?
That's a wonderful ending. So success for me means knowing that we've given it everything. And I think that's a very underappreciated feeling in these days. And I'm doing everything I can to have that feeling, and so many people out there are as well. And then it also means understanding that we're in this together. This is like a giant group work, but we won't know most of the people that are working with the same things, against the same struggle on the other part of the planet. And we need to rely on them to do something, and understand that they, in this very moment, rely on us to get going as well. And I think, honestly, that's quite a nice state to be in. And that is, for me, the most hopeful thing of all.
I love it. And what a perfect place to end. Luisa Neubauer, I don't think it's an understatement to say you're an absolute inspiration. So thank you for being with us here in the SDG Action Zone. I know we'll be seeing a lot more of you, and to everybody out there, we'll see you for lots more of the 2022 SDG Action Zone.